Change and Land Reform Committee's 8th meeting of 2021. The first item on our agenda is an evidence session on the environmental implications of the UK's exit from the European Union. And we're joined by Rosanna Cunningham, the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform. And the Cabinet Secretary is joined by her officials, Katrina Carmichael, Deputy Director, Future Environment, Environment and Forestry, Don McGilvray, Deputy Director of Environmental Quality and Circular Economy Division, and Ewan Page, the Head of UK Frameworks, all from the Scottish Government. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you for coming in this morning to talk to us. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement has been described by some as being blind to the devolution settlement, and I would like to know your opinion on what extent the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, in particular the level playing field and rebalancing provisions, how do they impact on the ability of the Scottish Government to exercise its devolved powers and maintain environmental standards and keep pace with EU law, as has been your stated desire?
Well, it's not just a stated desire, it's now a government commitment. So I think we need to just say that from the outset. And I just want to say one or two things, which is in general terms, the Brexit deal that has been agreed will hit jobs and the economy, and it's happening at the worst possible time. So I don't think we should shy away from making that statement. We've got Scottish Government modelling that estimates that the deal could cut Scotland's GDP by around 6.1% by 2030 compared to EU membership. So there are real issues facing us, and they are likely to be permanent new barriers in place that are going to cause immense difficulties. We can't fully mitigate every negative consequence. We will not be able to always do that. And the truth of the matter is, and I ought to say this at the outset of this particular session, that the agreement is very complex, is hard to read. It's going to be many months, if not years, before the impacts of this, what we consider suboptimal agreement, are fully understood. So all the comments I make have to just have that in our minds. In terms of a level playing field, there is at the moment considerable ambiguity and uncertainty in the deal on the level playing field provisions, and the non-regression provisions will permit divergence between the UK and the EU so long as overall levels of protection are maintained. But regulatory divergence from the EU does represent a risk to environmental standards in Scotland, and I think that's something that we probably would want to assert. And we do remain committed to maintaining or exceeding the high and very best practice standards represented by the EU in most areas. And obviously the Continuity Act does help us deliver on that commitment. The non-regression issue in the TCA that I've referred to will prevent a lowering of standards, but only where there is an economic impact. Divergence will be possible between the UK and the EU so long as an overall level of protection is maintained. So we're pressing the UK government for clarifications on interpretation and implementation. And to reinforce the need to take account of our devolved powers and responsibilities. And of course, it's not just Scotland that is in that position. It is also Wales and Northern Ireland. But with the current lack of clarity that I referred to at the outset, it's really difficult at this very early stage, given we're only a few weeks into the process, to determine what the UK government's approach is going to be to non-regression and potential levels of divergence, or the range of potential impacts on environmental protection standards in Scotland. So, you know, we've tried to take measures to pursue Scotland's interests. We do remain committed to maintaining or exceeding the high and best practice standards represented by the EU in most areas, and obviously the power to align in the Continuity Act does help us deliver on that commitment. There are more things I could say, but perhaps you want me to come back to you just at this point.
Yeah, I mean, my colleagues will probably dig into quite a lot of the governance arrangements. I would like to ask you about, you said, measures you've been taking to protect Scotland's interests, and obviously there will be conversations had with your government counterparts in the UK. Can you maybe outline for us just what the conversations have been, what access you've had to making these points that you've made to us this morning to the UK government?
Well, we make these points continually. We make them in a variety of different meetings that take place. There are some now more regular, what you might call four-nation meetings, but typically in these meetings on different issues, the three devolved administrations will be making roughly the same points to the UK government. So we are doing so on a very regular basis. But what we're still trying to do is to get clarity that the oversight and enforcement by domestic authorities do take devolved responsibilities into account, and that our supervisory bodies, including ESS, will be involved in cooperation on monitoring and enforcement between UK and European Commission. And we do want to ensure that Scotland's voice is heard in meeting the commitments to implement various multilateral environmental agreements and to cooperate on the trade-related aspects of environmental policy in these various multilateral arrangements. So, there is a dispute settlement mechanism for environmental protection with some rebalancing measures, but we are still seeking clear guidance from the UK government on interpretation and implementation. It is, I guess, very early days, so it is quite hard at the moment to see precisely how a lot of this will work. I don't know if you want more details of the dispute resolution process or not.
Yeah, I think my colleagues will come in with questions directly on that. Could I hand over to Liz Smith, please? Liz.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Yesterday, we had a private session with the House of Lords Committee, and while it was a private session, it was can't be very much on record, but it was a very useful session for two reasons. Firstly, there was an acknowledgement from the House of Lords Committee that there needed to be much greater engagement with the devolved administrations. But secondly, I think it allowed all of us representing this Parliament to put on record that we had concerns over the lack of clarity, and I know you've just outlined your concerns over that too, and I'm sure you will outline what you feel that the reasons are for it. Politics aside, could I ask you, what do you feel should be the mechanisms to ensure that there is much better cooperation between the devolved administrations in Westminster going forward? And secondly, and perhaps this is a more difficult question, when it comes to understanding where responsibilities lie, what do you think has to happen to allow that clarity of responsibility?
Well, I'm not entirely certain what you're asking me. I mean, the mechanisms for any of this will be both formal and informal, and at the moment it's very difficult to actually establish where the formal mechanisms, how they will work. So when I talk about the conversations that are had in various four-nation meetings, these are meetings that are being held on a regular basis for different purposes, and the similarity of conversation would be evident if you were tracking right across those meetings. But of course, in a sense, that's not formal, because these are not meetings that are set up principally with this issue in mind. These are representations being made at meetings where the principal issues are other than this very specific one. So at the moment, I would have to say that we don't have anything that is, in a formal sense, particularly helpful to us. And I have said a couple of times already that we are in a very early stage of this whole process. We all recognise, and I'm not making a party political point here, we all recognise that the deal was done at such a late stage in the day that we are actually in the process of trying to work some of this out at the moment. That we might have expected there to have been more working out beforehand, and in actual fact it's all being done now. So we're in a kind of difficult place right now in terms of the mechanisms. It's kind of hard for me to say what I think that should look like, whether or not it should be one overarching kind of thing, or whether or not we ought to expect that it will be more specific in specific areas. That has yet to be decided. What I am concerned about at the moment is that level of early working out that is going on does risk it developing in a way that isn't particularly structured and therefore doesn't actually take into account what it needs to do. And I don't think I'm being particularly party political. I hope I'm not, genuinely hope I'm not in this case, that I think there is still an uneven understanding at Whitehall level of exactly what devolution means and precisely what it covers. Now, I have come across that in a variety of different conversations over the years, a slightly uncertain, uneven recognition of what the reality of devolved responsibilities mean. And in fairness, I think, for example, the department that we deal with most often, DEFRA, is probably better at this and cottoned on earlier than many of the other departments. So it's a kind of, but it's still a little bit ad hoc. And I slightly fear, if I may say from my experience, that Westminster does ad hoc and always has done. Our structures tend not to be so inclined to that kind of ad hoc setup. And that's the thing that worries me slightly, that we're going to get a slight mismatch in culture here. And I don't think that's got to do with the political parties. I think that's got to do with a kind of institutional culture. So I'm trying to be as fair as I can be about the process of where we are at the moment. And I appreciate that I'm not giving absolute crystal clear answers, but I think at the moment it is impossible to do that.
That's a very helpful answer, actually, Cabinet Secretary, and I do agree with you, actually. I think there are different cultures here for some obvious reasons. Some perhaps could have been dealt with a little bit earlier, but what I think we need to do as we move forward is to ensure that the difficulties that you highlighted when you answered the convener's first question this morning, plus the complexities that you've just spoken about just now in the sort of ad hoc basis, we need to try to get some mechanism that there is full engagement with the devolved administrations and Westminster, because obviously there are overarching policies that some will be devolved, some will be reserved, and we have to be mindful of both. And it's whether we need to think in the next Parliament about a slightly different structure, a formal structure, because your answers this morning suggest that it's been a bit, partly because of time, and we can blame various people for this, that it's been a bit on a sort of unstructured and ad hoc basis, and whether we need to find some mechanism that ties things together. Now, I'm just interested in your views on that with the experience that you've had.
So, I'd need to be a bit careful, because effectively what you're talking to me about now is that impact of all of this on how the Scottish Parliament is going to go about its business in terms of its own scrutiny. And of course, ultimately, that wouldn't be a matter for, certainly won't be a matter that I will be involved in, unless somebody wishes to come and ask me for advice. I think it's difficult enough for ministers to keep across all of this, and we have the full resources of the civil service, and I can tell you that it is hard enough for us to just manage to keep up across this. And I think that I would well understand committee concerns, parliamentary concerns about some of the management of this, particularly because we've been bedeviled by very short timescales, which have made everything very challenging. Now, I think some of that might ease its way out of the system, because a lot of those very short timescales were pulling everything together, subordinate legislation to get everything ready for what was a very telescoped process towards the end. And I don't think, to be honest, in any parliament, including Westminster, is going to. I can see the convener's dog is agreeing with me. But I don't think even people at Westminster level would want to argue that what we had over the last year was exactly optimum. And appreciate that. What I think fundamental, however, is that it's going to be essential that the Scottish Government and that the Scottish Parliament are recognised as equals with the UK Government and Westminster. In their respective areas of competence. I think that's going to be absolutely fundamental, and that we therefore, both government and Parliament, should be meaningfully engaged in developing new structures and processes. And I think you would probably get almost exactly the same response from both Wales and from Northern Ireland. I think at the moment, the situation at the Westminster end is, as I said, still kind of very ad hoc, and I'm not sure it's working from first principles.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with a lot of that, Cabinet Secretary. I just think my final comment would be that I think, given the urgency of so many issues in the environment, we haven't got time on our side because of all sorts of things to do with climate change and biodiversity. It's important that the structures are up and running as soon as the next Parliament takes office. And again, it comes back, all that I read about and hear on this subject is about a lack of clarity and a slight concern over where responsibilities lie. So I think that's something that the Parliament has to look at carefully. But I'm sure my other colleagues will come back on other issues.
I think that's a big ask on that timescale. I mean, we are only a couple of months away, and I don't see any sign that it will be decided or set up by then. But I certainly think it has to be something that's at the forefront of everybody's minds. And the Scottish Parliament will probably have to relook at things like the committee structure to see whether or not there is a better way of doing it than we currently do. I don't know. I genuinely do not have an answer to that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And can I come to Finlay Carson?
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd just also like to appreciate you dealing with this in a non-party political way, and I think we all recognise there needs to be better work between Westminster and Holyrood to make sure we all achieve the outcomes we're looking for. I want to move on to governance of the trade agreement. And the trade agreement, the EU and the UK agreed to create a joint body called the Partnership Council to manage the agreement and oversee that its objectives are achieved. What are the Scottish Government views on governance arrangement and the trade agreement, and how will they need to be developed to ensure that the objectives of the agreement are met?
I mean, in terms of governance, you need to take all the comments I've made already so far into account, because the issues about clarity still apply. We do have overall structure of the UK-EU partnership, that is there, but there isn't any doubt, in my view, that the implementation is going to have a major impact on our our devolved responsibilities and interests, and that includes those related to future environmental standards, and indeed the Scottish Government's ambition to tackle climate change. So we are seeking meaningful involvement and representation within the governance structures and their underlying coordination and decision processes. And it is really important that our involvement does take account not only of our devolved responsibilities, but also, if you like, the reserved areas that touch on our responsibilities or that significantly relate to the territory of Scotland, as well as Scotland's separate legal jurisdictions. Now, there are discussions about the role of devolved administrations. That's 3 of us. The discussions have begun at official level, which is a good thing, and is typically how this begins. And it begins with officials talking to officials. But I'm sorry to say our experience throughout the process has meant that the devolved administrations have not felt that they've been involved in any meaningful conversations. So although officials are beginning to talk with each other, I've got to say I'll reserve judgment until I see the outcome. But I think that's what we have to aim for, a more direct, more formal and more acknowledged involvement in the likes of the Partnership Council. Because the structure is one thing, but if it effectively results in a door that's closed on the 3 administrations, who each of them have very specific devolved responsibilities of their own, then it is actually for them not meaningful, and that is a concern. And I do think what I've said before to Liz Smith is that a chunk of that is a kind of cultural, small c cultural assumption at the Whitehall level that that's what they need to do. So they're outward facing in terms of the agreement, and they're not thinking about the devolved responsibilities. Now, there may be some naughty political thinking going on as well, but I think in the main what has arisen is that focus on one direction for this Partnership Council and for these structures, and forgetting that there is an entire set of jurisdictions with different responsibilities and devolved responsibilities over very, very key and important issues. And I don't want them to be outside the door. And I think you're probably all aware that the Welsh Government is taking quite a hard line on some of this in a slightly different way to what we've chosen to do. So the concerns and the worries are shared across all the devolved administrations, and that does lead me back around to thinking that some of this is almost like about culture rather than a hard politics. I'm not saying the hard politics isn't there. I'm sure it is, but a lot of it's about culture, I think.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Now, we know the Partnership Council is going to be quite difficult because, as you've already stated, there's devolved issues, but there's also reserved issues which will have an impact on Scotland. And there are these specialist committees on level playing fields, but also on reserved, devolved issues like energy, transport, fisheries, and so on. Now, you've said that the culture might not be there, but can you tell me how you've progressed up to now in ensuring that Scottish interests are represented at that level? And has there any progress been made at all? And given that you think there's issues, how is the Scottish Government going to seek to reassure us all that Scottish interests are being represented? You suggested that it's civil servants talk to civil servants, and that's the first step. Do you need to be far more clear that there needs to be a change in culture, and it should maybe be driven politically rather than from civil servants if there's a cultural issue?
Well, I would have to say that we've never stopped making these points. the processes by which these things begin are, it does seem quite routine. So officials set up committees with other officials and they have their discussions at that level of operation, caveated always by anything that they might propose or think they are deciding is subject to ministerial sign-off on either end, or whichever end we're talking about. And that's as far as we've gotten overall at the moment. I should say that the specialised committees that you're talking about, we expect at the moment that each specialised committee and working group will most likely be led at official rather than ministerial level. This is the fallback process by which things are done, and it will have representatives from the EU and the UK with the appropriate expertise. Now, the extent to which the devolved level of responsibilities is played into that is not yet clear. And it would worry me that the initial process looks like it's officials only on the background of that kind of small c cultural issue that we have to deal with, that important devolved concerns fall off the table. And by important, I mean, you know, Scotland has an entirely separate legal system and is its own legal jurisdiction. You'd be surprised at the number of times that just gets forgotten about, and yet it's pretty fundamental to practically everything we do. So that's the bit that worries me. I mean, there are various proposed groups to be established through the TCA. Again, no clear indication of how Scottish interests would be represented in that. Those are the things that we are still having to discuss and talk about, and will continue to do so. I can't say to you, as the Scottish Government, that we are going to be able to do this or that or the other. All I can say to you is that we are definitely pressing at every opportunity that there should be proper representation for the devolved governments at every level, including ministerial.
Yeah, I take that on, but why is it not working up to now? If we keep on trying the same thing in the same process and we still get the same outcome, do we need to do it differently? With all due respect to the civil servants who are sitting around the table today, do you need to approach it differently? Because we're at a situation just now where you know, the Holyrood Committee have suggested we're not happy with the progress when it comes to, for example, you know, frameworks. So do you need to do it differently, or are we just going to keep on trying and the same old way and not making any progress? How are we going to do it differently?
Well, that'll be your last question because Mark wants to come in. Thank you.
I would respectfully suggest that some of that questioning ought to be directed at the Westminster government. I mean, I you know, with the greatest of respects, we cannot unilaterally dictate the process. The only government of the four that appears to want to unilaterally dictate process is the government at Westminster. So, you know, I know that the committee hasn't had great success in getting representatives before them from Westminster, but with the very greatest of respects, I think the questions need to be asked of them.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mark Ruskell?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I'll be brief. In terms of these working groups, I mean, there's a number of them: energy, transport, fisheries, EU programmes. There's a level playing field committee as a partnership council. Is it your wish that there'll be Scottish official representation on each of those committees? Do you see a case for Scottish officials effectively leading on some of these committees, for example, fisheries, where we have a majority interest in the resource within the UK? And do you see a role for parliamentarians, particularly in the Partnership Council? You know, there is a concern that parliaments are being locked out of this process.
Well, on the first part of your question, the answer would have to be yes, and we've made the case previously in different processes that should be the situation. Very much in those areas where there are very, very clear devolved responsibilities, and indeed perhaps an entire policy areas are devolved. But thus far, that argument in general terms isn't always or very rarely accepted. I mean, we can go as far back as Richard Lochhead, not being allowed to speak at a European Fisheries Council, despite that fisheries being an incredibly important issue. And when the UK government minister was not able to be at the council, they put a civil servant in instead of a government minister from a part of the United Kingdom that has huge fisheries interests. So this goes back quite a long way. So the answer to the first part of that was absolutely yes. The answer to the second is slightly more difficult for me to respond to because it's effectively parliament to parliament, and I observe a degree of unhappiness expressed from time to time by Westminster parliamentarians about being bypassed in respect of decision making and scrutiny. So I don't know how, in terms of parliamentary work, this will be able to be.
Do you think there could be an observer role, for example,
Sorry?
for parliamentarians? Do you think there could be an observer role for parliamentarians?
Good luck with that, I think, is what I would say. At the moment, there isn't even an observer role for devolved, governments, as far as I can see, never mind parliamentarians. So I would say good luck with that. And maybe over the piece something will be cobbled together, but I can't answer to that. I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know how easy that would be to set up either, to be fair, because it would cut right across other parliamentary duties. It would be quite difficult to manage that.
Thank you. We need to move on. I'm mindful of time, colleagues, and we maybe don't have time for 3 and 4 supplementary questions. So if you can be a wee bit more succinct, that would be great. Can I go to Claudia Beamish, who we have an audio only, I hope. Claudia? Claudia, can you hear us? Right, we have a sub to ask Claudia's question if she did lose connection. That's Stuart Stevenson. If I can go to Stuart, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I may cast it slightly differently from how Claudia would have, but that's not intentional. Product of what we're trying to do. Basically, I want to develop the issue of what future relationships with the EU and the institutions of the EU might look for, and to the extent to which the trade and cooperation agreement provides for that. We do know that many what are sometimes termed sub-state parts of Europe have direct and proper relationships with colleagues in the EU. To what extent do we see the Scottish Government being able to continue to have relationships with the EU, particularly because of our distinct and different environmental requirements, which are purely a matter of geography and climate? And just to try and get control of the timetable, in particular, are we getting collaboration with the UK government and the EU on strategic areas like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP26, so it will be in Glasgow, and of course the COP15 that there will be on biodiversity. So that's a big question, but hopefully we can deal with that in a relatively concise way. Cabinet Secretary.
I think, to be honest, it's very difficult to deal with any of this in a very concise way. If subject to easy yes, no answers, then I would be giving them, and you can see me shuffling backwards and forwards because the briefings that I have are similar across a whole range of subjects. You know, we are, and you know, it is our express desire to maintain not just effectively parity with EU standards, and to look to the EU for a lot of what we want to do, but we want to try and do that on a more organised basis. And indeed, I have an event coming up which is being put on by Scotland House, and that does involve European side of things. I've tried to keep contact with, for example, the chair of the European Environment Committee, trying to keep all of these networks going. I think you heard from Terry Ahern last week, and he talks about maintaining contact with the European Environment Protection Agency organisation, so that we don't lose those connections. At the moment, those are the ways that we are trying to do this. You will know that there are attempts to formalise some of these things. You've seen the attempt to try and formalise a continuation of Erasmus, but that doesn't work. If there are opportunities to formalise some of these things, I expect we would want to pursue those opportunities. But at the moment, it is difficult to see them. But I think it's pretty clear that people in Scotland do want us to retain close links with both EU institutions, but also with European member states. And that, frankly, is the path that we do believe represents the best future for Scotland. So I've indicated that I have been attempting to do that over these last months, with direct one-to-one meetings and conversations. I would anticipate that my colleagues in other portfolios have been replicating what I've been doing as well. We do have other mechanisms by which we can try to do that. The fact that we are European co-chair of the Under 2 coalition brings us into direct contact with a great many other devolved administrations right across Europe, with whom we have very good relationships. And throughout that, what we're trying to do is to maintain our increase our global ambition, but also to maintain our voice in the world. There are a variety of different things that I could talk about, where we, in terms of European Green New Deal. But if you're asking me yet about formal networks, I'd have to say not so much just yet. But then part of that is just the difficulty that we have at this moment, and the speed with which things have been happening, and our attempts to try and establish where we could perhaps have a more formal arrangement. We're not very further forward just now. Now, I think you were mentioning other things like OSPAR and all the rest of it, which of course go beyond the European Union. These are global agreements, and it's important that we be absolutely clear that we want to continue and take a leadership role in discussions at that level, particularly when there are work streams of interest, strategic interest for Scotland, as there often are. And also we have done a huge amount of work in terms of the other COP this year, the biological diversity COP15, and the Edinburgh process that we have led on. which is about representing effectively the under 2 level of administrations as well. So, we are continuing to do that, and to do so as formally as we possibly can in all the arenas that are available to us.
Right, Cabinet Secretary, just a very, very brief final bit. Obviously, there are relationships between many Scottish bodies in the third sector, different parts of government and Europe. To what extent is the Scottish Government supporting their efforts to maintain useful relationships with European counterparts?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're asking me there. Are you asking me about third-party relationships?
Well, clearly it takes time and effort for third parties and, for that matter, for SEPA, for Scottish Natural Heritage and so on and so forth, government bodies to maintain relationships. Is that something that formally the government is seeking to support in both respects?
Well, in terms of our public bodies, absolutely, but I don't think we've felt it necessary to formally say to them that they should be doing that, because they are all of them already wanting to do that and continuing to be as involved as they possibly can be at that level. It depends sometimes on the structures of multinational organisations. Is an organisation set up on EU membership alone? Or is it wider than that? So these are some of the practical considerations. But in terms of what they're doing, I can absolutely reassure you that we would not just anticipate that, for example, SEPA would want to continue to be part of that European group of environment protection organisations, but we would be positively encouraging them to do so, and we would see it as part of what they ought to be doing. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were talking about third party altogether. ENGOs in Scotland mostly do have already got pretty strong connections with global counterparts. So I'm assuming that they will obviously continue to be doing that.
Thank you. Can I move on to questions from Mark Ruskell? Mark.
Yeah, can I ask you about the transition to the new regulatory systems that replace the EU ones? So specifically the GB REACH with chemicals, UK ETS. Have you been monitoring those? How effective have been their rollout within the first month?
So we are, I could just bear with me while I get my notes in order. And I don't know whether you want me to talk about individual ones.
I mean, those two in particular are
the chemical ones, we've been fully engaged with DEFRA and with the Health and Safety Executive on the development and the launch. And for example, we've participated in the current REACH substance registration prioritisation exercise. So we're being fully involved in the parallel ongoing work on other new UK chemicals regimes. I understand that the chemicals industry have put proposals to UK ministers for revisions to the UK REACH regime to make it less costly to operate. Now, and here's an interesting thing, because obviously the Scottish Government's position is that the regulatory approach to chemicals has got to be compatible with our overall approach for maintaining alignment with EU standards. And we've not yet had the opportunity to assess whether industry's proposals would deliver this. So there's an interesting slight quirk, of course, that what happens is some industry sectors are only putting stuff up to UK ministers. They're not necessarily discussing it with us. So that's an issue which, in a sense, is outside the government-to-government scenario and is something that we will need to find a way of tackling. But we have been involved there. In terms of ETS, you just Give me 2 seconds. Well, I'm not sure I need to rehearse the ETS story. The committee is pretty much aware of where we've been with that. It is now operational. We're all, I think, pleased that we've got an ETS and not a reserved carbon tax. SEPA's issued all its permits under the new UK ETS. Decisions will be taken jointly by ministers from the 4 administrations on this particular common framework. There has been 1 meeting already on the 8th of February. Ben McPherson attended on my behalf because I had a diary clash. But one might say that notwithstanding the late decision making around that one is actually up on its feet and operating at a ministerial level, which I can only welcome. So it's obviously still a work in progress from our perspective. It's a standalone scheme. It's been designed to be link ready. The TCA does state that it does remain open to considering linking, and obviously we will continue to press for that linkage as soon as possible. Both chemicals and ETS are working. Those common frameworks are now actually working, but we're at a very early stage in the process.
Okay. So in terms of those industry proposals then for deregulation of chemicals under REACH, you're saying you don't have a view on that for the Scottish Government because nobody's bothered to speak to you yet? When will you have a view on it?
Well, I don't know, Mark. We've not yet had the opportunity to assess whether the proposals would deliver what we consider to be our overall approach of maintaining alignment. I don't have a timetable for that. I don't know. I can't answer that, and therefore I can't even answer if it will be me that engages in this. But we will be able, the moment we are able to do so, we will take a view. The point I was making was that presumption on behalf of a UK trade body that they just go to the UK government for this, notwithstanding that there are 3 devolved administrations also involved.
Okay. And just on the role of ESS then in terms of monitoring implementation of international obligations, what is, obviously it's early days for ESS, but what role do you see them playing?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it is very early days for the ESS. What we are expecting in terms of the way the ESS operates is that they will want to or may decide to have a look at international issues, but they won't, I suspect, want to be in a position of going into specifics. They're probably going to look at that in an overarching way, and it's obviously early. We anticipate that they will engage with other equivalent UK and European bodies to get the understanding of UK-EU cooperation arrangements. But ultimately, it will be for ESS to decide its own priorities and working methods, both now when it's non-statutory and once it is established in a fully statutory fashion. I would have expected that they will still focus on individual areas of concern with respect to international obligations rather than a routine broad monitoring effort, which would be quite a big task. Effectively, their role is pretty critical to demonstrating compliance with TCA, as it gives all parties reassurance that environmental standards in legislation are being reflected in regulatory practice. So I am confident that they are going to be able to do that job. But the way they set about their management when it touches on international obligations will be for them to decide their best processes. And I think we anticipate that they will be in full statutory form before the end of the year.
Thank you. Can I move on to questions from Angus MacDonald?
Okay, thank you, Convener. If I could turn to environmental governance, including intergovernmental relations, which has been touched on briefly already. Now, we know that Article 7.6 of the TCA commits the EU and the UK to cooperation on the effective monitoring and enforcement of the law with regard to environment and climate. Now, we've just been speaking about the ESS. Now, we were told that it will be seeking early dialogue with the European Commission and relevant European and UK bodies to understand the nature of arrangements that will be required at UK level and with the EU to fulfil its commitment or this commitment. So can I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, if you could advise the committee what the intra-UK governance that will be required to meet aspects of the agreement on good regulatory practice and cooperation on effective enforcement?
I'm not entirely sure I've got a great deal to add to what I said during the discussion with Finlay Carson about this. You know, we do have clear structures that have been established by the TCA. My concerns are about how the extent of our involvement in that, or whether or not we're going to be met by a closed door, which has often been the case. So, I don't want to go back over what I've already said about things like Partnership Council, okay. But I do think it is imperative that we are not met by that closed door. I think that's a really important thing to want to say, whether that's at the council level or at the specialised committee level. So, I've spoken about the ESS already. So from my perspective, I would expect the UK government to understand that it has to include the devolved governments in all of these structures and conversations, because if it does not, it's effectively setting devolution aside in everything it does. And I don't think that's what people want or expect to happen.
Yeah, indeed. So is it fair to say that the Scottish Government is not confident that domestic arrangements fully comply with the TCA in relation to good regulatory practices and environmental principles?
Well, I think I've already said that basically at the moment it's just all officials talking to one another, which is fine because they're the ones that deal with the nuts and bolts. But until we have proper ministerial engagement and are not met by closed doors, then at the moment I have to reserve judgment on how this will work in practice.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Convener, if I could move on to looking at replacement of EU funds. We know that we're no longer automatically entitled to participate in EU funding programmes such as CAP, LIFE funding or structural funds. However, I was certainly glad to note the agreement makes provision for UK participation in Horizon Europe between 21 and 27, although there seems to be some detail that access may be limited. Anyway, in addition to that, we've seen issues with regard to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and of course the UK Internal Market Act makes subsidy control a reserve matter, and the UK government's consultation on a UK-wide regime for subsidy controls closes, I believe, on the 31st of March. Can I ask what the implications are of rules on subsidies or state aid in the TCA, including for replacement funding programmes, for example, post-cap rural support? And does the Scottish Government have any further clarity about the development of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund and how it will be dispersed?
I think you've heard our frequent concerns expressed about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and I'm not sure rehearsing them here is going to take us further forward. It's a matter of concern over more than just this portfolio. From our perspective, future funding programmes must respect the UK's obligations relating to subsidy control and UK international trading commitments. And the UK government did undertake to do a consultation exercise around the establishment of a domestic regime that opened on the 3rd of February. It will close on the 31st of March. I'm not sure whether or not the committee has been able to do anything with respect to that. I have to say that consultation was launched without full prior consultation with the Scottish Government. So obviously, what we want to do now is to basically be properly and meaningfully involved in considering responses and the UK government's final proposals. And if there is a policy set at the UK level without appropriate consideration of Scotland's specific devolved spending powers, it could obviously pose a threat to devolved powers, which would be unacceptable. And I need to go back, however, to the point I made, right at the start of this, that we are not going to be able to mitigate all negative consequences of the loss of EU funding. We are trying to protect Scottish interests as far as possible, but it is simply not physically possible for the Finance Secretary to be able to find money to mitigate the withdrawal of EU funding. And that is going to potentially be problematic for us, and we will do as much as we can to manage that process. But unfortunately, I would not be doing my job if I was to sit here and mislead people into thinking that there is some magic way we could replace all of those different funds. So, I mean, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund has been the big example of, if you like, how not to do it. And that worries me slightly.
Okay, thanks. And another example of how not to do it, the UK Internal Market Act. I was wondering if you have a view on the implications of that, including provisions on state aid for replacement funding schemes.
Well, I don't really have a specific answer to that in the sense that the UK Internal Market Act pulls out the potential for massive disruption in terms of devolved responsibilities, and what neither myself nor anybody else can really establish is the extent to which actually it's going to be used. One might say that what the UK government has done is covered its back with the ability to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. Whether or not it will choose to, use that power is a difficult one to answer, and I genuinely don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think we're in uncharted waters. I'd hazard a guess as to saying that they're not going to use the powers necessarily all the time. They will undoubtedly at some point attempt to do so, and depending on what they choose to make their move on, it will be potentially incredibly controversial. But I'm now in the realms of guesswork here, and I think we all need to accept that the Internal Market Act has the potential to be extremely disruptive. Whether or not it will be used in its entirety and that potential be realised is a different matter entirely, and will depend entirely, I suspect, on other issues that are being debated at the time.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Angus. Can I move on to questions around future trade deals from Mark Ruskell? Mark.
Yeah, I mean, obviously environmental considerations will be paramount in future trade deals. I wanted to ask you, Cabinet Secretary, about your reflections on the negotiation of PCA and how you think going forward the interests of Scotland and the environment can be perhaps better represented in that process. What are the lessons here for the government from your perspective?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, I could repeat some of the things I've already said in some of the other answers. We do want to ensure that future trading arrangements do support our economic recovery, don't disadvantage domestic producers, don't undermine existing standards, and that includes on the environment, don't expose public services to competition or cause further divergence from the EU. And that's a kind of fundamental set of approaches that we would want to check against. It is absolutely vital that our interests in trade agreements are recognised by the UK government, so we're circling back around some of that conversation, and we do continue to call for an enhanced role in all stages of trade negotiations. In the meantime, we will do all that we can with the limited engagement that we have to ensure that our interests are identified and protected. And I think that committee members may be aware that in January, the Scottish Government published our Vision for Trade paper based on the principles that are important to us: inclusive growth, well-being, sustainability, just transition to net zero, and good governance. I mean, that's not obviously emerged from this portfolio. It has emerged from a different portfolio. But we have repeatedly called for a full and meaningful role for the Scottish Government and Parliament in all stages of trade negotiations. And it's back again to the question of the closed door. What is being discussed in those negotiations? What is being just not acknowledged or well understood in terms of devolved responsibilities? Some of it quite fundamental to agreements that might be getting made, and our inability, if we're met with a closed door, to basically make the point on behalf of Scotland that they are overlooking some incredibly key issues. And again, this is not something that is a concern confined only to Scotland. It is also a concern that Wales has and Northern Ireland has. So at the moment, it's some of the same story that we get across the board. And I did, although it's not a direct issue specifically relating in this portfolio, but I do, want to flag up that notwithstanding the fact that there is a different legal system in Scotland, that is frequently overlooked when these discussions are taking place, with the net result that Scots law is never even mentioned, and that in itself can create some issues. So there are some pretty fundamental things, and the separate legal jurisdiction of Scotland isn't something that emanates from devolution. It's been around, a few hundred years, and still it gets forgotten about at the level of decision making and negotiation, etc. At the at the Westminster level. So it's a bit worrying, and you know, that if they can forget about that after over 300 years, you know, the concerns about them not understanding devolved powers after 20 years are pretty serious.
Yeah, yeah. Sounds like a history lesson is maybe needed somewhere. Can I just ask about the vision for trade then? I mean, that is something that has emerged from this Parliament, from the work that the Parliament's done on trade justice principles, and the government's now taken that on. How does the TCA match up to that then specifically? I mean, if we're to say, okay, these are the clear principles that we're setting out as a nation for how we want trade to proceed, how does the TCA, how do we kind of monitor that? How do we set that against what the TCA has come out with?
Well, I mean, you know, I have to caveat that by saying this is, of course, not my portfolio, not my paper, and you would probably get a better conversation with Ivan McKee in respect of this. The vision for trade is effectively setting down our approach to this, our principles, how those principles ought to underpin the trading and investment relationships that Scotland has. It sets out the levers that we have at our disposal, and it identifies various asks of the UK government. So a closer reading of the Vision for Trade document will probably elucidate on that. And I go back to what I said, you know, we're repeatedly calling for a full and meaningful role for the Scottish Government and Parliament in all stages of trade negotiation. And that, of course, would help to ensure that the Scottish economic interests are recognised and identified, and it would allow us to ensure that the Vision for Trade principles are reflected in any trade agreements. The UK government hasn't accepted this role for the Scottish Government or any other devolved administration. So in the meantime, we do all that we can with the limited engagement that we have. You know, we're not where we would have wanted to be. The Scottish Government has been clear that we should have aimed for a deal with the EU that was far better than what we have, and closer to the pre-existing EU membership. And we don't want to see a shift of trade priorities away from the EU. And we're clear that we should be aiming to build global trade relationships with like-minded countries based on shared principles on trade. So the TCA does not reflect anything that we would have regarded as optimal, as I've said already. And our vision for trade and the TCA are of necessity not simply replicating one another, because that's not how we see our role in international trade. So the answer, you know, the short answer to yours is, well, you know, the TCA doesn't accord with what we consider to be the right way to conduct trade. But equally, at the moment, it's a closed door for us. Mm-hmm. And that's the big concern. I circle back around to that. That's the big concern. Who knows what will be decided behind that closed door?
Thank you. And I believe that that is all our questions this morning. Cabinet Secretary, I want to thank you and your officials for your time this morning. We are going to suspend until 10:15 to allow us to have a little break. Thank you. Right, our next item is consideration of 11 petitions which have been referred to the committee by the Public Petitions Committee. And members will all have had a discussion paper setting out what's happening with each petition, what stage it's at, and any recommendations. So at the current parliamentary session is due to end in just a few weeks. I think it's about 5 weeks. And the options available to the committee at this point in time are to either keep a petition open and include it in the report that this committee will leave for its successor committee, or to close the petition. And a couple of points I'd like to make to frame the discussion. For the avoidance of doubt, our report for the next committee cannot bind that committee to any course of action. That's up to them to decide what they do. And they have to decide what their work programme will include. But also in closing a petition, the committee can recognise that petitioner may remain convinced that work is still required, and that the option for them to engage with other bodies or maintain a watching brief is available to them, with a view to potentially lodging a new petition. Now, obviously, petitions are lodged and things happen in the parliamentary session which may impact on the issues raised in the petition. So what I'm going to do, colleagues, is I'm going to go through each petition in front of us, and if members would like to indicate to me in the chat box if they would like to come in and make any comment in relation to those petitions, then we'll make a decision on whether to keep them open or to close them off, and any other recommendations we want to make with regard to what petitioners can do. I should say also that all the petitioners in every case have already been contacted by the committee to say that we're actually going to be discussing their petitions this morning. So if I could go first of all to the Control of Wild Goose Numbers petition, which is PE 1490, and I believe that Angus MacDonald has something to say on that one.
Yes, thanks, Convener. As one crofter commented in the West Highland Free Press a few years ago, it used to be the geese that were endangered. Now it's the crofters that are endangered thanks to the geese. Now, I've been closely following this petition since it came in 2013. I served on the Petitions Committee at the time, and I was also on the Iraqi Committee. And while, as a result of the petition, there's been, albeit slow progress from ministers and Nature Scot, it's a fact that the geese remain a threat to crofting in the Outer and Inner Hebrides and also in the Northern Isles. Now, I note that SLE and the BASC in their joint submission to us state that grey-lag geese are probably the species capable of causing the greatest damage to crofting interests, but they then go on to recommend the petition is closed. But with the greatest of respect to SLE, they don't represent many crofters, if any, whereas the lodgers of the petition, the Scottish Crofters Federation, do. So with that in mind, Convener, and given we're informed that the current health pandemic has affected Nature Scot's ability to carry out fieldwork across goose management schemes, I believe this petition should be kept open to allow our successor committee to hear from the government about its review and how it plans to resource goose management in the next session, because resource is an issue, and we cannot allow the government to backtrack on funding schemes in the future. So I would suggest that this be kept open and placed in the legacy paper for the successor committee to continue further.
Thank you, Angus. And can I come to Liz Smith?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I tend to agree with Angus on that. I think that there are serious issues for crofters. That's very obvious, and I'm no expert on this, but I have followed the petition. I've followed some of the issues that I know have happened in Orkney with grey-lag geese. But I'm also aware that there are now growing concerns about Canada geese as well, in my part of Perthshire. So I would agree with Angus that I think it's well worth ensuring that the next Parliament looks again at this.
Thank you, Liz. And can I come to Finlay Carson?
I'm not going to go over the points that have already been raised. I agree with them all. This is an issue that I've been aware of since I was a student at Aberdeen University, when one of my colleagues actually sat for days on end counting geese. This problem hasn't been resolved yet, and I support any move that would continue this petition into the next session of Parliament.
Thank you. And Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, I would support a continuation of this petition as well. I mean, if someone could speak up for the geese here, I mean, these are, you know, internationally important populations of geese. Recognise the pressure, though, particularly on crofters in remote areas. And I think that's why it's really important that we get clarity as to how the next Scottish Government will incentivise the management of nature and the protection of areas and key species. So I think, you know, there's more to go on this issue. And I think in the next session, there'll be perhaps more clarity as to how compensation and support for crofters and farmers can be delivered as they're meeting nature targets, as they're protecting key species that are under threat because of climate change and a whole range of issues.
Thank you. And Claudia Beamish. Claudia?
Thank you. You can now hear me.
Yes, we can hear you now, Claudia.
Oh, that's reassuring. Okay, I don't want to reiterate what other members have said on this. I agree that it should be kept open, having been on the RACI committee before, and particularly identify myself with the comments of Angus MacDonald. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And there's no other members wish to speak, and I agree with all the comments that have been made. And I think it's worth mentioning that the work programme, not just of this committee, but also of government agencies as well, has been particularly punished by two things. I guess the Brexit preparations and the pandemic. So we have not been able to also take a lot of evidence in relation to these petitions as well, as what's been mentioned by Angus there about Nature Scot. So that's worth keeping in mind as well as we go through these petitions. So I think we're all in agreement that that petition should stay open for consideration by our successor committee. I'll move on to the next one, which is PE 1615. State-regulated licensing system for game bird hunting. Now, we may want to consider closing this petition, with the petitioner being encouraged to monitor developments over the next year. But I wonder if any my colleagues have got comments in relation to this. No. Are we in agreement that we should write to the petitioners and close this petition and ask them to consider monitoring developments over the next year, engage with any consultation that might be undertaken on the development of a licensing regime? I'm seeing people nodding. Okay, thank you, colleagues. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. So we're deciding that we will close that petition. The next petition that we want to consider is PE 1664, greater protection for mountain hares. And as colleagues know, there's the Animal and Wildlife Peninsulas Protections and Power Scotland Act 2020. Stage 3 had an amendment from Alison Johnson, which offered protection for mountain hares. So it's possible that we want to recommend that we close this petition because the issues addressed in the petition have been addressed by that piece of legislation. But I'll bring in colleagues. I believe that Liz Smith wants to come in on this.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, obviously there is legislation which at the time the Conservatives did not vote for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless we accept that is now in place. I would say, however, since that time, I've been approached by some falconers, and I know that various members of the REC committee have had the same approaches, that there are concerns from people who are working in falconry that there are still issues. So I think if we can keep a watching brief on that, I think it would be very helpful.
Okay, and I'll bring in Mark Ruskell.
Thanks. I mean, obviously, this was a very effective petition. It's been an issue that has been considered in Parliament over many years, culminating in that amendment. I mean, I think going forward, there are questions about how the licensing scheme in relation to hares will operate. So it clearly needs some ongoing attention and scrutiny from Parliament and for the petitioner to engage with that as well. But I think for the time being, this particular aspect is closed, but the ongoing scrutiny will need to continue, and maybe that's something that could be picked up in the legacy report to the next committee convener.
Okay, thank you. Finlay Carson would like to come in.
Yeah, very briefly, I think it's worth putting on record that we raised concerns about the way this amendment was added to the legislation, and as my colleague Liz Smith mentions, there's already been issues with it. Further scrutiny is absolutely needed, but that should have been carried out prior to us bringing in legislation. So hopefully the next Parliament will address any issues that legislation has given risen to. And yeah, I think we should close this one, but keep an eye on what happens with the legislation that was brought in. Yeah.
As we always do. So I'm getting an agreement from everyone that with regards to this petition that we close it, and we recommend that it's closed and invite the petitioners to stay. So, okay, we'll move on. So we have the next petition in front of us is PE 1705, Wildlife Crime, Penalties and Investigation. And given that we've just been talking about the Animals and Wildlife Act, which dealt with quite a lot that was actually raised in this petition, we might want to consider closing it for the same reason that the previous one, that a lot of the issues addressed in this petition were dealt with in that piece of legislation. Colleagues, if you have any comment in relation to this petition, please let me know, or just let me know if you agree that we should close off this petition. I'm seeing from Claudia Beamish agrees that we should close it. Are we in agreement? Yes. Thank you. I'll move on. The next petition is PE 1750, Independent Monitoring of Satellite Tags Fitted to Raptors. Now, we have had a certain amount of correspondence from supporters of this petition, which members will have seen in the last couple of weeks. I think we need to have a discussion about whether we keep this open and pass it on to our successor committee, or whether we close it. So I'll defer to members. If I can come to Liz Smith first.
Thank you, Convener. I have to say, I think this is actually a very important matter, and it's obviously had a controversial history, but I think as satellite tagging becomes more widespread and obviously the functionality increases, then it's essential, I think, that we gain as much information as possible, given what the tags will be telling us. And of course, it's also very important that all the stakeholders have faith in the processes, because I think that's been a major part of the controversy, and that whatever data is used is seen to be as robust and transparent as possible. And I think, obviously there's been a little bit of progress given the aftermath of the Werity review. I think there's an argument that these measures will go a little bit of a way to addressing the petition, but I don't think it's going to go the whole way. And I think it is essential that we have a much better understanding of the data and the robust information that we are requiring to make the decision on this, because I think there's a lot of stakeholders who are involved in this matter, including the police. And as I understand it so far, I'm not sure this Parliament has heard enough about this in terms of the data and the evidence. So I'm very much in favour of keeping this petition open, because I think there's a lot more to come on that. So I would urge us to keep it open. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Can I come to Mark Ruskell?
I mean, I hear what Liz Smith says. I think, though, that most of any substantive, if indeed there are substantive issues at the back of this petition, were dealt with that independent review of grouse moor management. I mean, I do note correspondence that we've had, which reveals that there's been meetings between the Scottish Raptor Study Group, a Nature Scot, and I gather it says in the letter it was made clear to us that neither Nature Scot nor Police Scotland had any substantive concerns about the way that we operate or communicate with the licensing and police authorities. So I'm not really clear what more there is to do on this issue, whether there is an issue here or not. And I would favour closing this petition, but I'll listen to what other colleagues have to say on it. If they think there is some substantive issue here, it's not clear to me, and it's clearly not clear to Nature Scot or Police Scotland what that issue actually is.
Okay, I'll come to Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Convener. I think there is still some doubt about the robustness of the information that's gathered from this, and we absolutely need to have faith in the information that comes forward. I still think there's a lack of trust and transparency, some of the information that's published, and we've still seen issues. I'm surprised that Mark Ruskell doesn't want to see this tightened up, because it can only be in the interest of protecting raptors to ensure that we get the most robust information. We've also got to look forward, and the legislation was put in place which will potentially bring in licensing, and this sort of information is going to be critical to looking at populations of raptors and whatever, and that information being very clear, transparently obtained. So yeah, I'm in favour of further work being done on this and keeping the petition open.
Thank you, and I'll come to Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. I'm keen that this petition's kept open as well. I've had quite a lot of contact with the Scottish Raptor Study Group, and also aware of issues of trust which have been highlighted by some other members. And I think it's important for groups such as RSPB and others, and indeed the many volunteers who are involved in all this work, to protect raptors better, have a clear idea of the way forward. And I think by highlighting this to our successor committee, that in that it's been kept open, it will be regarded as something that is significant and important as we go forward with the licensing of grouse moors, and also beyond that, the whole range of issues on the dire situation that we still have on raptor persecution. So I'd like to keep it open. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else coming in. I mean, I guess we're in a situation where we have had the Wellity review, and the government has said that they accept the recommendations of the Wellity review. But in terms of the issues raised in this petition, we need to, I guess, monitor progress on that. And I hear what all of you are saying. I'll just I'll come back to Mark, because you were keen to close it, but having heard the arguments from colleagues and seeing that it looks like we have a majority view that we should just keep it open, pass it on to a successor committee and let them make a judgment on whether or not to go forward with it. Mark, can I come back to you to see your thoughts, if you're in agreement with all of us? Keep it open.
I mean, I'm content to go with the consensus on this, Convener. I mean, there's clearly some debate around the matters that the petitioners have raised. So if that's to be dealt with in the next session, as part of monitoring around satellite tagging, how that fits in with the licensing regime that's yet to emerge as well, then I'm content on that basis, if that's the balance of opinion within the committee.
Okay, Liz, did you want to come back in?
Of the data, and I know that both sides of this debate feel quite strongly about this. They may want to draw different conclusions on it, but I think technology is changing all the time as well. I think we're in the business of having the likelihood of better data in the not too distant future, and I think that data is essential to making decisions, and that Parliament should be able to scrutinise that. So that's the basic reason why I'm very much in favour of keeping this open.
Okay, thanks. So we'll agree, we'll keep this open. Right, we have the next petition in front of us. which is PE 1762, entitled End the Killing of Wildlife on Grouse Moors and Elsewhere in Scotland. And again, do we want to consider closing this petition, given that Nature Scot review of snaring is due in 2021, and we have the newly established Scottish Animal Welfare Commission, which is expected to scope out work on this. So I get this might be one of those petitions that fall into the category of, well, it has been looked at by the Animal Welfare Commission actively, so therefore a lot of the objectives of the petition are being acknowledged by that body. But I'll come to members. I see that Mark wants to come in. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I mean, I think it's welcome that the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission are certainly, completing their work on glue traps, and that's one aspect of this petition. So, that's good that work has been done, and they will be publishing that work quite soon. However, there is that Nature Scot wider review of snaring, which is due this year, and I just wonder if it's a little bit premature to close this petition at this point, ahead of the publication of that review. And it might be an idea for a successor committee to take that Nature Scot review when it comes out and this petition and just perhaps put the two together. And I think at that point, we'd be able to, or the successor committee would be able to draw conclusions and perhaps bring this to a close. So I think it's almost ready to close this petition, but not quite yet. I think the last piece is that Nature Scot review, which we're all waiting for.
There is a point where it's worth making, though, that petitioners can lodge a new petition after a year if they feel that there's not progress been made. So closing a petition doesn't mean it can never come back. And given that there is work, so members want to bear that in mind. I'll come to Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Convener. The ask of this petition was the Scottish Government to conduct a full review of animal welfare impacts of traps and snares. Well, I believe that Nature Scotland, as we've heard, is going to review that 2021. So I would suggest that the petitioners have got exactly what they asked for. The committee that will follow on next year will review the Nature Scot report, I'm quite sure, and at that point I would like to think the committee will scrutinise it fully. So I see no point in extending this petition when in a way that the petitioners have got what they've asked for.
Yeah, I have to say I agree. That's what they called for, was a review, and that's what's happening. I'll come to Claudia Beamish.
Right, thank you, Convener, and I agree with the points that Finn Carson has made. I think, there's quite a lot of disparity in positions on this, and my own party has the position of really seeing that the traps and snares should all be illegal. But there are others with many other views on a spectrum, and I think perhaps what might be appropriate, although I'm okay with having the petition closed on, as I say, on the basis of what has been highlighted by Finn Carson, I think that I would like to see it highlighted in our legacy report, that it's something that the committee should be aware of, that there has been a petition, and that there are a range of animal welfare concerns and also concerns from those working in rural Scotland about how to deal with difficulties that occur, which at the moment mean that traps and snares are used, and there may well be alternatives. In fact, I understand there are. So I'm happy for it to be closed at this stage. Thank you.
And I guess it also shows that, when people do put petitions forward, that they can, feed into the other work of committees and maybe be addressed in other ways. So with that in mind, and Angus MacDonald would like to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Clearly the petition has been a success to a degree, and there is an opportunity for the petitioner to engage with the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission. If it transpires that that's not satisfactory, then the petitioner, of course, as you've mentioned, has the option to come back with a fresh petition to the Petitions Committee. So I'd be minded to close.
Yeah, and give them a chance to conduct the review. Right, I'm not seeing anyone else. I mean, I hear that Mark had some reservations, but it seems to be the majority view that we close this petition and allow this review to take place. Mark, I don't know whether you want to come back in or not, or whether you're satisfied with that general view.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing here then is that, you know, we sort of leave a firm milestone in our legacy report for the successor committee to come back to the Nature Scott review of snaring. I think it would be really disappointing if that review took place and then subsequent committee, you know, got very busy with whatever, and then, you know, we didn't return back to this issue. I think the petition would be very disappointed if that happened as well. So I think if we're offering a clear point in our legacy paper that the successor committee should return to this issue, then I think that takes it forward in an appropriate way. And then, as you say, convener, it's up for the petitioner then to look at the outcome of that review, and if there are still concerns around particular aspects of that and the work the Animal Welfare Commission are doing on glue traps, then they've got the option of resubmitting.
Okay, so let's agree to close that one and totally take your points about the legacy report as well. Let's move on to the next one, which is PE 1815, translocate protected beavers to reduce licensed killing. And the recommendation, we're thinking we've not really had an opportunity to consider this petition, so we may want to consider keeping this one open and passing it on to our successor committee to decide what they want to do with it. So I'm just looking at the chat box. Liz would like to come in. Liz.
Thank you again, convener. Yes, I definitely think that this should be kept open. I think this is a huge issue, obviously a very controversial one in some ways. Arguments on both sides, but as you know, there is a very important study taking place down in Devon on the River Otter, whereby I think we'll get a lot more information about translocation, etc., from that study. And just about every NFUS meeting I go to in Mid-Scotland and Fife, beavers are on the agenda, because I think there's a balance to be struck to ensure that you know, the natural world is protected, but at the same time that we can control the damage that is quite clearly being done to arable farms and to a lot of the riverbanks where clearly beavers are quite destructive. So I think it's essential that this is kept open, because I think there's a lot more to come on this issue.
Okay, thank you. I'll come to Finlay now.
Yeah, whilst I may not agree with the petition's ask at the moment because of the lack of information, I think it's important that this is kept high in the agenda for the next committee, because there is, you know, quite a wide range of concerns in regards to the reintroduction of beavers, and I think the Parliament should be keeping a close eye on this. So without any of the issues being addressed with the petition just now, I suggest that we strongly recommend that the successor committee takes this on, and it's a review. Let's hope, I was going to say in the same way that we look at the deer review, but let's hope that actually we can come to some conclusions with the beavers as we pass this one on.
Yeah, and I guess there's lots of things that we would have liked to have made space for in our work programme, and some of these petitions are some of them, but it's just been an extremely busy session. I'll come to Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that this petition is kept open. I think, you know, we're what, year and a half on now from the protection status for the European beaver in Scotland and the management regime that was put in place. I think there are questions around that. And I've got constituents as well, probably the same constituents as Liz Smith, given that we share a region who want to see translocation of beavers out of Tayside and into the Forth Valley. So, you know, and they're farmers. So yeah, I mean, I think there's issues here about economic benefit. There's issues here about mitigating and managing some of the negative impact of beavers in inappropriate areas, but also ensuring that we can bring positive economic benefit to areas and you know, natural rewilding benefits to areas that need it. So yeah, it's getting that management regime right and the balance right, and I think it does need a bit of care and attention in the next year. So I would welcome this petition being kept open.
Okay, thank you. And Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I agree the petition should be kept open for all the reasons stated. I just want to put on the record, as I have in the past, that individuals in Scotland taking unilateral actions that lead to a reintroduction of species without proper consideration and management of the negative impacts that may arise in certain circumstances is utterly unacceptable. And the individuals who are behind the introduction of beavers in Tayside continue to have my utter contempt.
Yeah, and we do remember that a managed situation did turn out to be an unmanaged situation with regard to that. So I think we're all agreed that we're going to keep that particular petition open. We'll move on to the next one, and that is the petition number PE 1636, require single-use drinks cups to be biodegradable. Now, we may want to consider closing this petition because there is a great deal of work being done on the expert panel on environmental charging and other measures. And largely what this petition is calling for is being addressed. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to come in on that, but that is certainly the recommendation, is that we close off this petition. If people are in agreement, just let me know. If you want to say anything, then let me know that too. Colleagues, are we in agreement to close this one? Yes, we are. Right, let's move on. In a similar vein, PE 1755, ban all single-use plastics across Scotland. We are recommending that we close this petition. The petitioner could be encouraged to engage with the Scottish Government and the work that will undertake following the report from the expert panel on environmental charging and other measures. So it's a similar situation to the previous petition that we mentioned, and the recommendation is that we close. Is everyone in agreement with that? As there is a route for these petitioners to follow. Thank you, colleagues. Right, the next one is PE 1751, create no wild camp zones in Scotland. Again, recommendation we considered is closing this petition because the necessary powers to create legislation to enable local authorities to create no wild camp zones are now in place, and this matter is also under consideration by the Scottish Government. And I see that Finlay Carson wants to come in on this. Finlay.
Thank you, Convener. I'm quite concerned that I know this specifically addresses wild camping, but I wonder whether we need to keep this open to look at will be and how the local authorities actually dealing with. We are almost quite a substantial increase. We saw the issues in some rural areas last summer, a massive increase in the so-called dirty camping, and have a difference between wild camping and dirty camping. So I would be in favour of keeping this look at the implications and the impact of increase in visitors into rural areas. I know it suggests that we are able to legislate. We know, sadly, there's only 2 national parks in Scotland. We know just exactly what compulsion there is or desire within local authorities to spend more money, which they don't have to enforce this. So I would like to see this petition kept open.
You're breaking up a little bit there, Finlay, but just a reminder that the petition did call on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to create legislation to enable local authorities to create no wild camp zones in Scotland, and that those powers are now there. So it could be that the petitioner may want to come back with a different wording on that petition to maybe raise the issues, if they still have the same issues that you just mentioned there, because effectively their objective has been achieved in the wording of the original petition. But we can discuss that. I'll come to Liz Smith.
Thank you. Yes, I think, Convener, that's a sensible suggestion. This issue is not going to go away. Yes, it's absolutely true. I think the Scottish Government's taken on board that there are lots of issues that need to be addressed in this. But what we did see last summer, and I'm somebody who very much distinguishes between wild camping and dirty camping. I think they're two completely different things. But nonetheless, I think that they are hitting against each other, and I think it's very important for a lot of our rural communities that we continue to look at this. So maybe it's a case of saying in our legacy paper that, you know, while some measures have been taken, which we support, we do recommend that this is looked at again, because there, you know, I thought last summer was actually very distressing in some circumstances as to what was happening in some of our rural areas. So, and I think local communities, dare I say, would probably want us to continue to oversee this.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's something that we need to mention in our legacy paper as well. I mean, just because we've got this legislation and there's powers in place, this still could be an issue, this dirty camping, as yourself and Finlay have just said. I'll come to Angus MacDonald then, and Finlay wants to come back in. Angus.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. There's an argument that the issue of enforcement may be more appropriately dealt with by the Local Government and Communities Committee, particularly given that the issue the petitioner raises has been dealt with. So I wonder if it's possible to perhaps close the petition, but highlight the issue to the relevant committee.
Okay, and I'll come to Finlay and then Mark. Finlay?
Yeah, Convener, I'd just like to put on record, I think I agree with with your recommendation in other petitions, that the petitioners have certainly got what they've asked for. However, I would certainly endorse the opinion that we should highlight this in our legacy paper going forward. And as Angus MacDonald said, it should maybe be highlighted to the Communities Committee. It's certainly something worth monitoring, but I agree that in this instance, the petition could be closed because it's achieved what it set out to achieve. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I would back that. I think that's a helpful suggestion from Angus. I mean, there's the enforcement issue. There's also the issue about resources for wild camping as well in Scotland. And, you know, I did a bit of wild camping on Loch Tay last summer, and it was really, really busy. So, you know, there are people who want to go out there and responsibly wild camp. And I think, you know, there's a wider economic issue about domestic tourism that the Parliament should be aware of as well. But there's also the issue about dirty camping, which I think, you know, is a straight enforcement issue. And, you know, I think it's appropriate for that local government committee, in whatever format it's in the next session, to be considering that, particularly as we head into this summer, which is going to be even busier, probably.
Yeah, no, it's a good suggestion. So let's do that. Let's close off this petition for the reasons that we've all said, and I take up Angus's suggestion, mention it in our legacy report as well. So thank you. Right, next, we move on to petition, another petition that we've received a considerable amount of correspondence from the petitioners and supporters on, which is PE 1758, End Greyhound Racing in Scotland. And we need to discuss what we do with this particular petition. Obviously, we have the establishment of the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission has included this issue in its work plan, and we would encourage the petitioner to engage with them on this. But we do need to decide whether or not this is a petition that we want to hand on to a successor committee, given that we haven't taken an awful lot of evidence on it ourselves. So I'm just going to go to Mark Ruskell first.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I'd be very disappointed if the committee closed this petition, because we haven't really seen any progress in the last year in relation to the need to enhance welfare standards for greyhounds. I mean, the recent bill that we considered, the Animal Welfare the Animal Wildlife Penalties and Protection and Powers Act, I mean, that really considered breeding and it considered maximum penalties for welfare offences, but it's due to the nature of greyhound racing and the way that the industry conducts itself means that it's often very difficult to actually bring cases and prosecutions to bear in relation to animal welfare offences, and the breeding aspect in relation to greyhounds is less of an issue. It's more about how the animals are treated when they're in that racing environment and how they're kept. So I don't think that the recent bill that's gone through Parliament has addressed any of the concerns that the petitioners have. And I'm kind of quite disappointed by the response from the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission as well, because I would have expected this being a long-running issue with a lot of public support to be at the top of their agenda. It appears that this might be an issue which they consider as part of a longer-term work plan. But I think the issues are clearly there now within the racing industry within Scotland. We've got unregulated tracks that are in operation, including in Fife in my region, and the need for action is now, and the need to consider this as an industry that has a very particular form of self-regulation is critical. It doesn't fit easily into some of the wider animal welfare issues that we've been concerned about. So I think there's more to unpick here, and I'd like to see the petitioners given the opportunity to address a parliamentary committee, not in this session because we've run out of time, but certainly in the next session.
Yeah, again, sadly, the work programme pressures we've been under hasn't allowed us time to take evidence on this. Can I come to Finlay Carson?
Thank you, Convener. I would suggest that given that the new Scottish Animal Welfare Commission has suggested it will be included in their work plan, that we can maybe write to the Commission asking them to review it in a shorter time scale rather than the longer time scale. We have had the new legislation brought in about breeding and so on, which will make some difference. But I would suggest that we could write to the Commission to ask them to deal with it in a more timely manner, given the concerns. I would suggest we close this petition, but that doesn't give any. I hope that the petitioners don't suggest that we're not taking this issue seriously, but I believe the right body to investigate it further is the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission, and I would suggest we write and ask them to report back to the new committee as soon as possible with any concerns they have over animal welfare issues with greyhounds, including licensing tracks and whatever. But I think we should close this and ensure that we do get a report back to the new committee and the new Parliament.
Okay, can I come to Stuart Stevenson? Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. This is a subject that I've had over the years quite a number of constituents approach me on, and indeed bring rescue greyhounds to meet me. And I feel very uncomfortable about the existence of unregulated, unlicensed tracks, the so-called flapper tracks. I think the current arrangements are not adequate to protect the interests of greyhounds. And I would personally prefer to see this kept open until we see a more definitive resolution to the issues that are properly being raised by people. I'm not going to divide the committee on this because I think there clearly will be ways forward for this to be pursued, whether we agree to keep it open or to close it. But my preference would be to keep it open, Convener.
Thank you, Stuart. And can I come to Claudia?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I would like to see the committee considering making a recommendation to keep this petition open. I'm aware of issues over the years at the Dumfries track, and I'm also concerned that now the new Scottish Animal Welfare Commission has not put it as one of their, as I understand it, their priority issues in timescale. And while I agree with Finn Carson that it would be good to write to the Commission, I wouldn't feel comfortable with closing this until there was an answer. And we don't really have the opportunity, I don't think, to necessarily revisit this as a committee. So I'd like to keep it open and highlight any response from the Commission. But also I do feel, and you're quite right, Convener, that we've had an enormous amount of pressure with legislation, but I do feel that we haven't taken enough evidence on this ourselves as a committee to have been able to show how serious, certainly some of us, I won't speak for everybody, but some of us regard some of the issues around this to be. So I would be in favour of keeping it open and also highlighting it in our legacy report. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. And I think you're right. I think until we should write to the Animal Welfare Commission, but given that we probably unlikely to get a response in time to make a decision on this, that we maybe should just keep it open and see what comes back from them. But also, your points are valid. We have not taken much in the way of evidence on this. I'm going to come back to Mark. Mark, did you want to make a further point?
Well, it's just to say I think Finn makes a useful suggestion there of writing back to the Animal Welfare Commission, asking them whether they could bring this in their work programme in the short term. But I think we should do that and keep the petition open. And if the Animal Welfare Commission are able to report back, that might help a future committee.
Yeah, and let's bear in mind that it will be for the future committee to decide what they do with this. So they may be in receipt of a response and make a decision that's different from ours, or they may agree to take more evidence. Finlay, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, thanks, convener. Yeah, I listen to the comments, and I'm happy on reflection to keep it open. However, I know what you're saying. It's up to the next committee to decide whether to do anything. I think the concerns are considerable enough that we should write a letter, that we should still write to the Welfare Commission asking for a report to be brought forward, whatever. So whether we just, so there is a report on the table for the future committee to decide on whether they want to take it forward. I think that's important. So yeah, in reflection, yeah, keep the petition open, but write a strongly worded letter encouraging the Commission to do some work, so the new committee will have some evidence to work upon.
Yeah, good suggestions. All right. I think we're agreed that we'll keep this petition open, and we'll also write to the Animal Welfare Commission on the issues that everyone's raised and the issues that are in the petition here. Okay, so that is everything. We've discussed all the petitions, and our clerks now have a record of which ones we want to close and which ones we want to keep open. And the petitioners, obviously, a lot of them will be watching this, but we'll be in contact with them all on our decisions. Our next meeting on the 2nd of March, the committee plans to meet wholly in private to consider the legacy report and to continue its consideration of the Climate Change Plan Update report. And that concludes the public part of our meeting today. Thank you, colleagues.